Hello people, it's time for us to go back to our interior design. Before we start applying materials, we need to find references from real photos. And why from real photos? Because we're trying to achieve a realistic interior render. So the best way to go around it is to find real references so that we can mimic the lighting and also the kind of materials that we're going to apply to this particular design. Now, I think it's better for us to go for a rustic design because we're going to be able to see more details in the materials rather than just going for a plain white wall. So for instance, we can go for a brick wall, we can go also with wood that has a little bit more detail in it, a bit more texture, and so on, rather than just a concrete wall or rather than just just a plain white wall, which we will not be learning a lot from it. So let's go and find some references for our render. Now, a very popular website is ArchDaily. Here, I'd say 90% of all the projects are going to be real photographs. And also, most of them are taken by professional architectural photographers. So we can also learn from their photographic compositions and their lighting skills. So let's go and look for a rustic design. Okay, so once I start looking, I can find some interesting designs. So I'm just going to open this one in another tab. And you can see how beautiful the lighting is in here. We can also see how the exterior light comes in and we see these reflections going on in the floor and on the wood, and also the different textures used for this particular design. We can see that they're playing with multiple materials here. We have concrete, we have some kind of tiling here. We also have wood and a wall paint. So they're working with multiple materials here. So this might be a good reference for us. You can also go ahead and look for other type of references, a little bit more rustic. Again, here we have some really nice reflections in the floor. Obviously the carpet won't let us see further, so I wouldn't add any carpet to our design. We can also have a look at the TV and how the reflections are just being distorted. Also the reflections, the very smooth reflections, very diffuse, if you will, on the wood. We have different kind of tone in each one of these. We have the beams in a darker tone, then we have a lighter color here in all of the doors and so on. So this is also a very good example, and we can have an idea of where we want to get with our renderings. So this is what we can find in ArchDaily, and you can just look around and make sure that it's not an actual render. We want real photographs so that we can mimic the physical world into our render. Let's have a look at this one too. This one has a very nice lighting going on. So you can see these strips of light coming down and basically just scattering all over the design. Another good reference, we can get it from the Pinterest. So if you just type in rustic in Pinterest, you'll get lots of different examples that we can just grab and take a render from there. So this is the first step that you have to take to create a realistic render. You need to find different kinds of references, and the best ones are from professional photographers that are just dedicated to the architecture photography. So again, in this example, we can see some rustic design, how the reflections on the floor are coming in, the different tones, again, from the wood. So we have an idea that we don't need to use the same texture for our beams and our floor generator in this case. So basically we have multiple materials going on. So we already know which materials we need to go for. First of all, we need to have a texture that will go with our floor, which is a bright wooden material. Then we have the structure, which are the beams and columns. Here we have a darker wood. And finally, for our ceiling, we have a bit more brighter tone to it compared to the beams and columns. And also, obviously, the furniture has a similar color tone to the wood and the walls used here. Another thing that we have to take into account is that the exterior lighting is very bright. It's coming in pretty strong, so we have to keep that in mind. Lighting is the key to a good render, don't forget that. So let's go ahead and go to our textures.com and find some materials that will go for our rustic interior here. Alright, so first of all, we need a material for our floor. So I'm in the wood category right now, and I'm just trying to find a rustic light wooden color. Maybe we can go for these, Zebrano veneer or a worn wood. We can give a little bit more reflection to this wood here. And let's not forget that we also need a reflective material so that we can mimic these reflections that we get from the exterior lighting here. So I'm going to go for the Worn Wood 2. And I can just play around with the tones in Corona Renderer. So for the moment, I'm just going to download one of them. So let's go down here. Okay, so first of all, we have the albedo, which is basically our color. Then our normal map, which we've already seen what it can do. Then obviously our roughness. And finally, an ambient occlusion map. So we haven't seen this one yet. So let's take a look at it as we go along. So let's grab the medium-sized texture, which is the freebie. So let's just download these four. So next I'm going to find a material for this type of brick that we see here in the chimney. So let's go to the PBR materials and brick walls, and here we have the brick walls. And I think we can go with this medieval brick wall, which has a smoother surface than this one. I think this one is way too pronounced. We can also go for a rustic brick, but let's just keep looking down here if we can find something similar to that chimney. We can also try these yellow old bricks, but I think we're good with the medieval one. So let's go for this one. All right, so again, in this case, we have the albedo. We already know what it is. The height. Okay, the height is a displacement, and we've talked about it, but we haven't tried it yet. So this is going to be a good exercise for us. So let's grab these 5 textures. Obviously the freebie ones, which are completely fine for now. Alright, so back in our interior design, let's go to our Slate material. And up here, I can actually create another tab. So I can name this one the sky, because I have my sky here. So I'm just going to rename it to keep everything organized. So right click and rename view. This is going to be sky. Let's hit OK. And then I'm going to create another view or another tab by create new view. Right click, create new view. And this one is going to be called materials. And OK. This way, if I have lots of materials that I've been working in and then I try to find my sky, for instance, I'll just go back here and find it right away so that I can change its lighting. So let's call in all of the materials that we've downloaded. Alright, so first of all, let's go for a wooden material and let's just drag them like so. So first of all, we have the A0 and then my albedo, then I have my normal map, and then I have my roughness map. So right now I'm just going to rename these maps because sometimes the rough map, it's really similar to the ambient occlusion map. So we're going to see what ambient occlusion does in a moment. So I'm just going to type in here AO. And in here I'm just going to type roughness. Obviously this is the color and this is the normal, so there's no need to go and change their name. And now I'm just going to bring in the brick material. So again, first we have the ambient occlusion. Then we'll have the color. Next up we're going to have the height, which is going to be our displacement so that each brick can have a different height. Then we go for our normal map. And finally our roughness. So again, I'm just going to name this displacement. This is going to be my rough map and my AO, which is my ambient occlusion. So let's start building these materials. Now obviously I have to bring a Corona physical material so that I can input all of these into a material itself. And I'm just going to copy this by holding the shift key. Alright, so let's start with the wooden material. Now remember that I said that we could change the tone of this wooden texture because most of our references had the floor, the structure, and the ceiling with different wooden tones. So for this, I'm going to use this component which is called the Corona Color Correction. Now the Corona Color Correct will help me change the appearance of my overall texture. For example, if I need the color of the texture to be brighter, I can do it by using the Corona Color Correct component. So the gamma here, if I add a little bit more of it, it's gonna make my material a little bit lighter. I can also control the temperature of the material, so it works like Kelvin temperature. So if I go down here, it's gonna make my material a little bit more warmer. And if I go all the way up, it's gonna make my material a little bit more cold. I can also control the hue and the saturation of my material, also its contrast and its brightness. So the Corona Color Correct, it's a very powerful component that we'll be using throughout the course, so we'll be practicing with it a lot. Now, first of all, I'm just going to put the Corona color correct over here. So we're going to be ignoring it for a second. First of all, we need to just input these correctly. So we have the AO map and the actual texture. So if I open my AO map, we can see that this map will add a little bit of extra detail to my actual wooden texture. Remember when we were mixing the materials with our rowboat, we actually gave it some dirt on it by using the Corona mix component. So we are going to use the same method with this one. So to mix the AO, because I only want to extract these darker tones, and then mix it with my actual textures so that my imperfections from this wood will stand out a little bit more. So for this, I'm going to go to my Corona mix. So let's type in Corona mix. All right. And again, remember that at the bottom, we will have our base material, which is going to be my texture. On top of it, I'm going to add this extra detail and then blend it in using the multiply option. So let's add this to our bottom and now this to our top. And obviously nothing will happen because it's an add. So I'm basically just adding a white image to my wooden texture. So I don't need that. So let's go ahead and change this to multiply. And if I right click, you can see that now I have a little bit more of that imperfection from my wood, or that detail of the wood, because it's not really an imperfection because it's a natural detail. All right. So what if I just unplug this? You can see the big difference there. So the AO map really makes a difference. So I'm just going to plug in this to my base color like so. And now I have my rough map, which is obviously going to be at my base rough. All right, and you can see that it's way too much, but we're going to be playing around that in a while. And then our normal. So we already know that for Corona renderer to work with a normal map, it needs a Corona normal component. So let's bring it down here. Let's just plug this into a normal and add gamma to input. Now I'm going to add this to my base bump and let's see how my material is actually doing. Okay, so it has way too much reflection on it. So obviously I have to lower the rough bitmap. However, let's just try another method. So if I right click and open my preview window, you can see that this rough map, it's really dark, which is making my texture really reflective. Because remember that it's the white color that brings in the roughness. So because this is so dark, it's gonna read it like so, and therefore it's gonna make my material really reflective because it's making it really smooth. So you can see that even if we are downloading the PBR materials, we actually need to change its settings so that they can be a little bit more realistic. To just brighten the color of this rough map, I'm going to use the Corona color correct. So let's see how this works. I'm going to just plug this in, and now I'm going to plug this one into my base rough. So let's go inside this Corona color correct. So the first thing that I want to do is just to lighten this color up because it has way too much dark tones to it. So for this, I'm going to go to the gamma option here, and I'm just going to type in 2, and you can see if I open the preview window that I've lightened up this texture like so. So this is the original one, and this is the modified one that we've achieved just by increasing the gamma option here. So let's go back, and now if I open the preview window, this is no longer so smooth. You can see that the reflections are a bit more diffused, if you will. So let's go grab this Corona physical material. And now that I've added an extra gamma to it, and let's go back and let's say that I'm going to add a number 3. Okay. Now this has lightened up my whole material, but the roughness of it has also popped up a little bit more. So I'm going to go back here, and I'm actually going to turn this roughness into 1, and I'm going to lower the gamma to A2 because it's brightened up my whole texture now. Now this is obviously not doing its work, so I'm going to go all the way down here, and we have the maps option. So in the base rough, we can just tell it to work at 70%. Now we're seeing a big difference. So maybe 80 because I don't want to lose the roughness so much. So there, let's leave it at 80 for now. Now let's go into our bump option. The bump, it's a little bit too weak, so I'm going to add maybe a 3 for it. Okay, now we can see some textures going on in there, like so. Maybe it's a little bit too much. Let's go back to a 2. And there we go. It's looking pretty good. All right, so let's go ahead and add this wooden texture to the beams up here. So obviously, if I select the beams, all of them are part of my whole mesh. So I need to separate these beams. So the way to do that is to detach them as an element. So they're going to be a separate element. Now let's go to a lateral view. So I want to just select my beams, and let's just select the whole mesh and go for a polygon selection. Okay, so I just want to select the beams like so, and remember to toggle the F2 key so that we can see through our polygon selection. And now I'm just with my Alt key, I'm just going to deselect everything that it's not my actual beams up here. So let's go ahead and check if we're actually selecting only the beams, and we actually are. So let's go to the edit geometry and detach them. Now let's detach them as elements. I don't really want to detach them as a single object, just as a new element. And what does that mean is that if I go up here into my selection mode, these beams are still going to be part of my whole mesh, but they're just going to be a separate element within that mesh. So let's go ahead and detach them, detach to element, and let's hit OK. All right, now if I just select my mesh, you can see my beams are still part of my walls, my ceiling, and my floor, and everything else. But if I go to element, I can see that now all of these beams are separate. So let's just select all of them. Let's go to the material editor here, and I'm going to right click and assign material to selection. Now obviously, if I have a better look at it, so let's go into another view. I'm going to go for a perspective view, so P for perspective. Alright, let's go inside of here. Now I can see that my UVW mapping, it's all over the place. So we have to fix this. So while grabbing these beams, I'm going to add a UVW mapping to them. And I'm going to go for a box option because they have a box geometry. And let's pick a 300. So I'm going to copy and paste it. So Control C, this 300 centimeters. I'm going to go to math width, Control V just to paste the same value. And there we go. Now let's just see if this is working, and make sure that your actually UVW mapping is heading in the right direction, which it is. So my wooden texture is actually wrapping in a horizontal way. So let's take the gizmo for the UVW map. So inside our modifier, we also have a gizmo, and let's just rotate this one. And let's just say that we had something like this. So if that's your case, just grab your gizmo, press the E key for rotation, and just rotate it horizontally, because this makes a little bit more sense. Now I think the scale is a little bit off, so let's reduce it. I'm going to go for 150. So Control C and Control V, the same value for all of them. All right, so we've added one material. Now what we can do is just to add these beams to the material override exclusion. So let's just select them. Let's hit the element for selection, and I'm just going to select these guys, and I'm going to go to the render setup here, and let's go to the scene tab, and here we have the objects excluded. So I'm going to add these beams to my exclusion list, hitting this positive icon like so. Now let's deselect the element and go back to our UVW map. So make sure that you're doing that, because you can see that if we don't go back to our UVW map modifier, these beams are not going to be mapped. So let's hit the UVW map and start interactive. And there we go. Now if you look closely, we can see that the mapping for the bottom of our beams, it's in the wrong way. It's actually vertical. We needed to go horizontal because this is not accurate, this is not real. Let's just select the UVW modifier, and I'm going to select the region just to see this top beam here, and let's start our interactive render. Alright, now while having both of these together, I'm going to go to my gizmo, and I'm actually going to rotate this in the blue axis, which is the Z axis. Okay, so let's see if this will fix the problem. Alright, so that actually fixed it. Now my UVW mapping is actually heading in the right direction. So let's stop this and let's just deactivate the region. And let's go back to our UVW map modifier. Okay, now let's go for our wall here. So I'm going to go for my polygon selection, and let's select all of the faces that compose my interior walls. So I'm going to, again, I'm just going to detach it, and as element will be fine. Okay, now that I've detached it as element, if I just grab the element, I will be selecting all of my walls like so. So let's go ahead and create a brick material for this. and I'm going to just do the same method that I did up here. So let's go for a Corona mix, just to mix the brick with the ambient occlusion so that we can have an extra detail there. So we know this whole process, how it works. I'm going to go for the multiply option, and now with my rough, I'm going to just plug this base rough here, the base color over here. Now we have the displacement. We're going to see how that works in a moment. And the displacement will go into the displace input. Finally, we have the Corona normal. So I can just grab the one that we have here ready, clone it by holding my shift key, and I'm just going to input this to my normal, and this one will go to my base bump. So it's actually up here. Now I'm going to right click and assign material to selection. And now let's go ahead and render this. So let's go to our setup here, into our scene tab, and start interactive. Okay, so this is actually looking pretty nice. And let's go closer to this back wall so that we can see how the displacement works. So I think this needs a little bit more of displacement. Press our P key so that we can move closer to this wall here. Now let's start our interactive rendering again. So these bricks are looking pretty nice, but let's just go into our slate material. So let's get inside our Corona physical material, which has our brick texture. Down here we have the displacement. I'm just going to stop this for a while. And here we have the minimum level and the maximum level. So the displacement will actually play with the height of each brick, and it will extrude them, if you will, in the normal direction of the wall. So for the minimum level, I can have one of the bricks at 0 centimeters, so it's going to be basically flat. And at the maximum level, I'm going to have 1 centimeter as the maximum extrusion for each brick. Let's take a look at the displacement map. So right click and open preview window. Now in here, the darker colors, you can see that each brick has a dark color. The darker colors are going to be extruded by 0 centimeters. So they're basically going to be flat. Now this is the darker colors. On now the lighter gray, it's going to be extruded by 1 centimeter. So this is a very low value. So now I can tell it that the min level, the minimum level, so the darker bricks are going to be -2 in the normal direction. So they're going to be pushed basically by 2 centimeters. And the max level, the brighter bricks, are going to be pulled by 2 centimeters, or they're going to be extruded by 2 centimeters. So by changing these values, let's have a look. Now they look much more real, and we can keep on playing. So maybe we can go for a -3 and whoops, let's open this. We can go for a -4 actually, and a 4 value. Maybe this is a bit too much. It still looks good, but it's not going to be that realistic. However, because the brick, it's a medieval brick, and in the medieval times, they were not so precise. Right? So this might make a little bit more sense, but I'm just going to leave it at -3 and maximum level of 3 centimeters. Okay, so let's go back to our camera. So let's just press the C key, and there we go. That's all to it. I'm just going to see how everything looks with my new displacement. Okay, so this is looking very nice so far. Now, what I'm not a fan of is that our ceiling is way too close, and our beam seems that they have a very small height there. So I'm just going to drag my ceiling up a bit, like so. Consequently, I will have to bring all of these vertices in here a little bit higher. So I'm just going to go to my selection so that I can grab these vertices easier, and I'm going to bring them all the way up here. So now it's time to work on our floor. So this is where it gets pretty interesting. Now each board needs to have a different UVW mapping and also different types of tones. So let's go ahead and look at a reference. Okay, so in here we can see this example in which each wooden board has a different value of brightness to it. So all of them are really different. We can also see it in a top view here that each one of them has a different UVW mapping, if you will, of their own. So they have a different tone and they also have a different texture to them. So how can we mimic this in 3ds Max? So we basically have to give each individual board a different character. So let's go back to our 3ds Max, and there's a component for that is called the Corona multi-map. Alright, so inside this component, we have the option to randomize each element if they're instance elements, or the most important one down here, the mesh element. So each one of these boards, so if I go to my floor generator and I'm just going to isolate it, so Alt plus Q, and I'm going to copy it. Finally, I'm going to turn this into an edit poly. So if I go to my element and I just pick one, you can see that each board acts as a different element. So that's pretty interesting that the floor generator can actually do that. And this is because the developers of the floor generator were thinking of the multi-map, because here in the randomize options, we have the mesh element. So we can actually create these random values of brightness, of color, and of saturation for each mesh element. In other words, for each board. Okay, so being said that, down here we have the item count. So the item count, if we have multiple textures, we can tell it to affect the 6 textures that we have, or in this case, as we're only going to be working with one texture, which is going to be our wooden texture, we will have this item count down to just 1. But for each element, we can randomize the hue random, the saturation, and the gamma random. So remember that the gamma will lighten our texture up, the saturation will obviously make it a little bit more saturated, and the hue will just bring the primary colors such as yellow, red, orange to be a little bit more pronounced. So in here we have the percentages, where 0% will disable the randomization, and 100% will give it a maximum level of randomization. However, 2 to 5% should be more than enough for our boards. The same goes for saturation and all of the other options. Now in the seed here, the seed will actually change these variations. So we have hundreds of different types of variations of our randomizations that we can have. So you can see the power of this component. So let's just copy this same Corona physical material, and let's just connect our texture to this multi-map. So I'm just going to double click. The item count is 1 because I only have one texture, which is basically the Corona mix, which became just 1 when we mixed both of these textures. Now each board, I want to have a random of 5% in gamma, also 5% in saturation, and the hue also 5%. So they're going to be totally different. Now we can solve the different tones of the wood with this, but we can't actually solve the UVW mapping, because if we go back to our example here, we talked about that each of them has a different UVW mapping in them, which is the most important one because we can see the difference between them with the different UVW mapping wrapping on them. So let's go back, and now for this, it's no longer the Corona multi-map, but rather the Corona UVW randomizer. The name is actually literally to what we need, a random in the UVW mapping. So let's connect the multi-map. So first of all, we're changing each of the tones for each board, and then we're going to change the UVW mapping on them. So again, we need this to be as mesh element. Actually, let's just uncheck the instance for this one and for this one too. And again, we're going to be selecting the mesh element for the reasons that we've talked about so far. Now, first of all, we have the scale. So we can randomize each board by the scale of the UVW mapping. So for instance, if I want to lower the scale of the UVW mapping for each board, I'll go to 70. And the maximum, it's going to go for 130%, which is not much. Let's not go crazy like 200% because that would just look weird. Now we can also offset this board in the U direction and in the V direction. So I can say that the offset of this mapping can go for -10 to 10. So it's not much. I'm just giving a little bit more of extra random. And in the V direction will be -10 to 10. And the rotation, we don't actually want to rotate it because we saw what happened with our beams. So if we rotate the UVW mapping, it's going to look weird. So I actually don't want to rotate this. Okay, now we obviously need to add a UVW map modifier to our board in order for the UVW map component to work. So I'm just going to add this to our base color, and I'm going to go to my default shading, and by selecting my floor, I'm going to right click and assign material to selection. So the first thing that we notice is that the UVW map is totally wrong, so we have to add a UVW map modifier like so, and let's go for the box option, and we already know that this is probably going to be at 150 by 150 by 150, because don't forget that the UVW mapping works in 3 dimensions, so we need these 3 values. We can see that the position of the map is okay, doesn't need to be rotated, so sometimes if we have it in the wrong way like so, make sure that you have it in the right way but just rotating it. So that's all to it. Now the next thing that we have to do is to add this floor to our exclusion on our material override so that we can see the material that we just applied. So let's go to this positive icon and let's head to our camera. And now unhide all, so right click, unhide all. Okay, so we can just check it now. Let's go to our scene and start interactive. Okay, so this is looking very interesting. We have the reflection, just like in our reference, coming in. Now, one thing that I'm worried about is that all of our multi-map parameters are a little bit exaggerated. So let's go back to our material slate and let's go to our Corona multi-map. So here we have that the hue random is at 5. So let's just lower everything here. Let's just make it at 2% each one. Okay, maybe the hue is not something that we really need to change, so let's set it as 0. Let's just play with the saturation and the random in the brightness, or in other words, the gamma. So let's start the interactive render. Okay, so that looks much better now. We can actually use the hue a bit, just at 2%, looks pretty nice. So this is actually looking really great. Now the same thing will go to our ceiling. So for this, let's apply the same material to our ceiling. Let's just actually copy this whole material, and with my shift key I can just drag it upwards, and I'm going to add this to our ceiling here. Now remember that in our references the floor and ceiling had different wooden tones, so we have to add a Corona color correct just in case. So let's bring the Corona color correct and drag it over here, and let's connect our last component to our Corona color correct and input this one to the base color. So if we go inside of here, we have the gamma, which will control the actual tone of our material. So I'm going to grab this material, so double click on it. So I'm going to select the ceiling and right click and assign material to selection. Now remember that we also need to add a UVW map modifier to this one. So I can just go into my floor and right click, copy. Now let's head to our ceiling and right click and paste. And now let's see if the UVW map is actually in the right direction. And we can't see it because we have to put it as an exclusion. So let's go to scene and let's exclude the ceiling. Alright, so we can't actually see it that well because of the beams here. So let's go to a different view by pressing the P key. And let's actually look how this is doing. So clearly we can see that this is in the wrong direction. So let's just stop our render and let's head to our gizmo in our UVW map. And I'm going to just select my angle snap toggle and rotate it by 90 degrees. So that's horizontal. There we go. Now let's go back. So now we can see that the direction is heading in the right way because of our rotation of our UVW mapping. So let's go back to our camera. So just press the C key. So let's just start the interactive render again. Alright, so everything is looking very nice, and actually on the reference, so let's have another look at our reference. The floor is actually way more brighter, so we have to brighten up this wood here. So let's go back to our material editor And I want to rename this one because I don't want to confuse myself, because remember that this one at the top is for the ceiling. So let's rename the one at the bottom. Let's just name it floor. And this one just ceiling. There we go. So using my Corona color correct, okay, and we haven't added a Corona color correct to our floor. So let's just bring one in, Corona color correct. Let's just bring one in like so. I can just increase the gamma, and I'm going to go for a 1.6 increase. All right, so I think that would be enough. Let's just try it out. And there we go. Now it looks better and we're following our reference. Now another thing that I'm not really happy about is that all of these beams seem to have the same tone to them. So we can actually just grab these three components with our shift key, we'll copy them down here, and we're just going to connect this one with the Corona multi-map. And now I'm just going to replace our new integrated components to the base color like so. So now my beams have the variation that the multi-map and the Corona UVW randomizer give. But now they are way too light, so let's just go with a 1.3 in gamma just to make them darker, and maybe just a 1.2. Alright people, so this is the scene that we've ended up for this lecture. So if you tried your own references and just tried to mimic those references to create some other materials that are not here, well, congratulations for that. If you haven't, I highly suggest to finish up with this one and then try and create your own scene using your own references. So for the next lecture, we're going to wrap up this scene by adding some materials to our window frames and also to our door here. So thank you so much for listening. I'll see you there.